Well, hello, everybody. I am delighted to welcome you here to the Center for Global Development. It is truly an honor and pleasure to have Raj Kumar here, the author of this book, The Business of Changing the World, and also the co-founder of Devex. And I think it's fair to say we at CGD have a special appreciation of the importance of the Devex platform, which now I think reaches at least 1 million members. Like many others, it's our go-to platform for reaching the broadest possible range of development practitioners and financiers and policymakers and programmers. And I probably don't have to say to this audience that growing and strengthening that platform could not be more timely and critical as we observe the challenges of inequality and poverty and climate change and migration and lack of confidence in governments and even in democracy pervading not just the developing world but the developed world as well. So the platform is really, it was innovative and now it has become essential. This is not a book that shrinks from the hard questions. I recommend it highly. Mine is highly dog-eared. Most fundamentally, the question of who controls the allocation of aid and how do we measure results. Is it governments who are supposed to control the allocation because they're supposed to represent the voice of the people? If it's governments, should it be donor governments or should it be the recipient country governments? Should it be well-intentioned billionaires? And if so, should it be the billionaires with the most money? Or should it be the billionaires with the best results measurement frameworks? Or should it be the billionaires that are actually starting to develop organizations that deliver development services? And then how do you figure out up front how to measure results when you know that the problems are hard and complicated? The design up front, the ideal design up front is very uncertain, and you're pretty sure that you're going to have to execute some course corrections as you implement the development programs. And you're supposed to have developed a results measurement that accommodates all of that adaptation. So I'm sure many of you in this audience have already thought about these issues and perhaps are grappling with them in your own jobs, but it's rare to have an opportunity to really directly confront those questions in this kind of conversation. So you have bios for Caroline and for Raj. So I won't go into any detail. Raj co-founded Devex in 2000 in his Harvard dorm room. On the advice of his dean, Dean Nye, as he explains in the book, he left the Kennedy School to focus on the business. I'm assuming that was not because you were in academic difficulty. And moved it to a 2-bedroom apartment in DC, which had 8 staff members, 4 of whom actually appeared to live in the apartment. So Raj knows something about some fundamentals to development, taking a lot of risk, understanding the market, creating a startup, and turning a really ambitious vision into reality. It's a special pleasure for me to introduce Caroline Atkinson, who, it's fair to say, was one of the finest public service I served with in the Treasury Department. When things got rough in the 1990s in emerging markets, as they did periodically, you can be sure, and I witnessed myself, that the Treasury Secretary always had Caroline at the table when difficult decisions had to be made. So she's no stranger to hard questions either, particularly questions where the wrong answers could have huge consequences. After that career high point, she served in other organizations almost as distinguished, the IMF, the White House, and Google. So, and we at CGD are very proud to have Caroline as a member of our board. So Caroline and Raj are going to have a conversation for about 45 minutes, then turn to you in the audience to participate. So please have your questions ready. We have a lot of us joining online, so please feel free to tweet at CGDev. using the hashtag CGD Talks, and we will try to incorporate some of your questions in the conversation. The book will be for sale right outside this glass wall, and Raj has graciously agreed to sign some copies. So let me now invite Raj and Caroline up for their conversation.
Thanks very much, Nancy. And of course, Nancy's also always been a great public servant and one that it was a joy to work with in at the Treasury back in those days. I want to, Nancy gave a great summary of some of the questions and point and objective of your book, Raj. But I wanted to ask you to lay out for people what, from your point of view, were the key insights from the analysis, the data, the work that you've done with Devex, and what are the key messages that you want people to take away from the book? Yeah, I was going to say it's a big book. It's not actually physically that big, but it has a lot of content in it and it touches on a lot of important subjects. So for you, what are the most important ones?
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, CGD and Nancy, for that lovely introduction. Just quickly, Nancy talked about the origins of Devex, and I will tell you, I mentioned this in the book. When I was a grad student at the Kennedy School and I asked people, how do I get a job in development? They all said, come to Washington, D.C. and go to cocktail parties. That's the way you find a job. And I was kind of shocked that that was the system. So fast forward to 2019, there are now two options. You can go to the Devex job board or you can go to CGD events. This is the advice I give people. So it's really an honor to get to be here with all of you today. Yeah, this book is a reflection, I think, on the last 20 years of me starting out knowing nothing about global development, really just faking it when we started Devex, to now having interviewed thousands of people and traveled around and sort of said, what's actually happening in this space? So to me, the biggest thing that's happening in global development today is an industry disruption. We're very used to using that term when we talk about other industries. We read about Tesla and Uber, and we're looking ahead to an automotive industry or an energy industry that's going to be fundamentally different. Our kids aren't going to recognize the life we led in those areas. When it comes to the news media, we're used to hearing about Facebook and Twitter just revolutionizing that space for good and for ill. But in development, I think we sometimes avoid the discussion. We think, oh, there's slow and iterative change. And what I have seen up close is I think we're at this moment of real disruption. So that's kind of the main thrust of the book. And the core disruption that I see is a shift from really thousands of years of aid and charity being organized around generosity to moving to a much more results-driven approach, where what matters most is results. And I don't think that revolution is entirely completed or we're over it, and I think there's a lot of tension in that question, but that's a lot of what I see is this move toward a results revolution. I guess to answer the second part of your question, kind of what do I want everyone here to take away from that, is I think industry disruptions create opportunity. Things are fluid. And we have a chance to shape what is the aid industry we actually want? How do we design it to be fit for purpose? And I think sometimes the conversations are somewhat separate. We sort of assume the aid industry is what it is, and then there's the sustainable development goals and sort of the rest of the world and government decisions. And I would like to advocate to all of you and those who read this book that the aid industry is ours. It is a public trust, whether it's taxpayer money or philanthropic money or corporate or nonprofit initiatives. It's all part of the public sphere. And we ought to have a voice. And how do we want to shape this industry to actually achieve those sustainable development goals? So that's the real takeaway that I hope people will take.
Thanks. Now, there has been some criticism, and mostly, by the way, this book has been very well reviewed, but some criticism, perhaps the meanest, unsurprisingly, was from big player in the old aid industry, but the criticism that you're too trusting of market-based solutions, you're too trusting and too willing to trust the billionaires, although you do a bit of billionaire shaming when you call out Jeff Bezos for wanting to send people into space rather than fix some of the problems down here on Earth. But what's your response to that criticism that maybe you just are too willing to believe that market-based solutions are the way to go?
It's a very fair point. And in fact, last week I was on NPR, and a lot of the questions were around that question because they're very political in nature, very timely. But I think two things about that. So one, I'm not sure everyone has fully come to terms with how big the wealth inequality actually is. So the usual debate that I hear is, why don't we tax instead of having billionaires donate? And when I do the math on, for example, the wealth tax proposed by Senator Elizabeth Warren and the higher marginal income tax rates proposed by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, if we instituted both of those, by my kind of back of the envelope math, many of the billionaires would get richer. And I know that seems kind of crazy, but the level of wealth that exists today, the assets are so large, they're growing so quickly, that even if you add a 2 or 3% tax to the wealth, and even if you take 70% of every marginal dollar of income, you actually end up with people whose net worth are in the billions, annual income is in the billions after taxes. So they're growing their net worth every year. And so I happen to be in favor of a more progressive tax regime and higher tax, but I don't think it's an either-or proposition. And in fact, Bill and Melinda Gates, when they began this journey of giving away money, they were worth $90 billion. They've given away nearly $50 billion actually to date, and they're now worth about $110 billion. So their wealth has actually grown during that period. And I think it's emblematic of the challenge that we have. We're not going to solve inequality. It's very unlikely we'll solve it with a tax regime alone. It's possible, it can be done, but it's unlikely politically that will solve it all. And at the same time, we have all these challenges in the world where even if we got the tax rates to where the most progressive American might want them to be in this country, very little of that money would make its way into smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa or into the last mile health issues, right? So what I'm calling for is, let's look at all of this tremendous wealth, this historic wealth that's out there today, as an opportunity. The philanthropy is coming. There's a tidal wave of philanthropy coming from billionaires and from wealthy individuals and ordinary citizens donating through their cell phone and through apps and Kickstarter and things like that. Let's shape that. What do we want that to look like? That's what I'm calling for. And then briefly on markets, I am not suggesting in this book that markets are sort of the answer to everything and business is the answer to everything, but I think market mechanisms are often underplayed in our industry. And so that's really what I'm pointing toward, is you can have a market mechanism which is a nonprofit or which is run by a government. A challenge grant is a kind of market mechanism. It doesn't necessarily have to be about for-profit business, but those mechanisms can be really powerful.
Right, thanks. I want to push you a bit on this notion that there's a ton of money coming, and therefore then makes sense to think about how we shape it. But you also talk a lot about how it's going to be spent differently. It needs to be spent differently from how it was spent in the past. And when you characterize the past, you talk about it being very rigid and large projects that aid ministries and so on have pushed, big charities have. But how different is it to think of the kind of money that may come from billionaires or may come from other donations of wealthy individuals, or indeed from governments to come? What are the results that will be so different from how they spend their money from the way that governments have been spending their money so far?
Yeah, and governments are also changing. It's not as though government itself can never get it right. In fact, I give lots of examples about USAID's changing in particular, using these kinds of market mechanisms, the development innovation ventures, funding for-profit social enterprises. But I do think that private giving, whether from ordinary people or from billionaires, you do have the opportunity to take a lot of risk. And the aid industry today is still largely government funded, and it's very risk averse. The worst thing you can do is get that headline in the Washington Post that says some money was lost, it was stolen, and you can very quickly get to the point where even a successful program with a small blemish is seen as a failure in political terms. And so I think it's essentially put handcuffs around a lot of our best aid workers and development professionals, including at agencies like USAID or at DFID, who feel like risk is the biggest issue and that they have to be careful to minimize that, as opposed to what we want is to say to these professionals, what would you do? What would you go out there and do in terms of innovation and risk-taking to actually change the dynamic? That's not largely the way things work today. And the new money coming in is giving us a chance to make that happen. So I remember going to MIT to a student science fair that was designed around development and humanitarian issues in 2010. I saw all these brilliant engineering students with these really cool contraptions they had designed. And in a way it was exciting and inspiring, but in a way it was also a bit depressing, because I went one by one and realized none of these will ever see the light of day. There is just no market for it. There's no way to commercialize it. There's no angel investing for these kinds of products. One was a health kit designed for the needs of rural clinics in Nicaragua. There's just there's no way that money exists. Today, that's not the case. Today, because of a lot of the private money and the changes in government institutions and the way they fund, you can actually have a great innovative idea and get funding for it and scale it up. I talk about 1 Acre Fund. I talk about Zipline. These are examples. Zipline is now a unicorn. It's $1 billion company that delivers blood by drone in Rwanda. I mean, that's an amazing story, and that wouldn't have been possible, not just because of the tech, but really because of the way our industry was structured. It wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago.
Right, and it's certainly true that tech can change the way that that our industry or the aid industry works. But there are some ways some parts in your book where I'm getting riled up or amped up, maybe enthusiastic about, give directly, how you can get cash to a specific program if now through all the transparency that there is through these websites. And then you're very critical, on the other hand, of the old Save the Children type of program where there's a poster or a picture of a child in need and you can sponsor that child's education. Then I started thinking, well, what exactly is the difference? Okay, the mechanism of giving is different, but the focus on a story about, a needy person, a child, in the one case through the brochure or the photograph or the ad or whatever from Save the Children, in another case from the website Give Directly. It's advertising in a different way, but it's not appealing to a different part of human nature, nor is it offering a transformative experience on the ground.
I actually sit on the board of Save the Children, so I won't give that example. but think about child sponsorship in general. And I think the difference is the cost structure, right? Because the way these sponsorship models have been designed in the past, a lot of money goes into marketing, a lot of money goes into the fundraising side. And then because you're trying to connect that donor sitting in the US or Australia or the UK to that child, they want to feel that direct connection. There's a huge cost in that, and almost a top-down kind of deterministic approach here where the donor says, well, this is what I want for that kid. Give directly is a pretty fundamentally different idea, which is actually the decision-making is entirely in the hands of the person who gets the money. They can spend it on literally anything they want. And in fact, they have this website called GD Live, which I like to go to because it's kind of fun to watch. And these are people who are often their daily income is about 50 cents or 75 cents a day. These are people really at the bottom of the pyramid who have gotten this $1,000 gift from Give Directly. And they go on this platform through their cell phone and say what they're spending the money on. And you can literally see what they're doing with it. Some of them talk about, I have a mud floor and I've made it better, And,
yeah, and you have a nice story about the guy who said, I bought myself some smart clothes.
Yeah, and he says, I feel like a man now because I'm dressed right, And so you can actually see what people do with the money when you give them the agency to make that decision. And I think our old model was very much, well, we can't trust others with cash. We've got to decide here in the US or in the UK or what have you. And so we're going to set up an elaborate system around this, and we're going to tug at the heartstrings of donors to make you feel good, because it's really more about you feeling good maybe than that end result. And I think the questions being asked today are different. They're about, for that marginal dollar you can invest, what's the result that you can see? And it's not so much how you do it. In fact, a lot of the new instruments that are out there that are pay for results don't really prescribe how you do it. They just sort of say, whoever can get the best results can get the money. And that's a much more market-oriented approach.
Right. Going back to the Give Directly, you also talk in the book, so you're open about that, that there are problems there, because in that model, some lucky person gets, well, they start off by being very unlucky, having very low income in a particular community, and that's what qualifies them to get what is an astounding amount of money relative to their income and expectations, but also relative to their neighbors.
Sure.
So I can imagine that could lead to quite a few social problems in the neighborhood, and why the hell does that person get it? And look, they only went and spent it on their mud floor or their new clothes or whatever. And you could stir up just as many problems perhaps that way as the kinds of problems that happen. We're all familiar with the one laptop one child, that people got computers and then didn't use them, and so on and so on. So how do you deal with that issue, or how do you think the new industry should think about those comparative issues? Who gets to benefit?
Well, one thing I try to make clear in the book that is not a surprise to anyone here who does this kind of work is there is no silver bullet. But that might be a little surprising to the average donor, or even to the new billionaire philanthropist who thinks, I've got it all answered, I've figured out how to build some giant corporation and win in my market, and now I'm just going to come in and write a check. And there is no simple thing like that. And things like Give Directly are exciting within a certain context. Just like microfinance is exciting within a certain context, but there are limits to it. So I agree that all of these things have real challenges. The new thing, which is, I talk about in the book, is kind of a broad trend that I see that's kind of taking over across sectors, is this idea that let's not treat people like widgets. Let's not think of this purely as resource allocation. Let's think about behavioral science. Let's think about more complex systems. Let's actually talk to the people we're trying to work with, this sort of human-centered design approach. And I think that has a lot of applicability across these kinds of questions, because rather than theorizing about something like Give Directly, you can design it in a way where right up front you're talking to people, you're asking people in these communities, you're seeing how they're spending the money, and then if you're finding things aren't working, you're iterating and changing.
That's relying a lot on really smart delivery of these products or this money, and really smart selection of how to get money into people's hands. And you do have a comment in the book about, cash. People, and I think this is true, we've learned this in many cases in developing countries, but also in developed countries, that actually people are quite good at deciding what they should spend money on, and giving money is often a better thing than giving goods. But how do you see the problems of sorting out, doing all of the iterating, all of this stuff sounds great, that you won't have a rigid plan, you'll have a plan that can adjust, you'll fail fast, in the words of some of the tech companies. But then when you're in the field and life is what it is, and maybe you're dealing with the same aid workers who've been trying to make their projects work anyway, what are the mechanisms of making a difference there on the ground?
I think a big part of it is the way you design the project itself, right? So we've come from this industry where everything is project oriented. If you meet somebody who works in development, you say, what project are you on? What project are you going to? When does your project end? We think in these terms. And I think where we're headed now is not project oriented at all. It's much more systemic. It's like starting a business. And so when you think in these systemic ways, one of the first things is probably you need to be indigenous to the location. So it's probably much more about empowering government to execute on these services or deliver them, or local organizations or locally staffed organizations. It changes the dynamic quite a bit from the project concept, I think. And so when you fund, it changes the way you fund. Because if you're a traditional foundation, if you go to any of the traditional foundations' websites, they have a grants database. And you can look it up by date, and they'll say, we gave a grant of $3 million to this organization over 2 years, right? That is not the way you think, I think, in this new framework. I think you think in terms of things like development impact bonds, or pay for performance, or startup funds, or challenge grants, or tiered financing, or development finance institutions that are making equity investments or debt investments. You're thinking in a different financing structure, and I think that allows you to be iterative. It's when you have a project orientation where you're giving a contractor a grant, a fixed amount of money over a fixed time, and you're worried about that money going astray, that you're sort of forced into decisions early on that you might come to regret. It becomes very hard to. So yes, it's the same people, the same aid workers, the same development professionals, maybe even the same organizations. But what I'm calling for is maybe a way to unlock that passion and that expertise.
There's another, as you're talking about it, I'm reminded, and I've been around long enough to know that there are cycles.
Right.
And the World Bank went through a period of thinking it was very important to have people in the field, and which you remark is a quaint expression, but anyway, I'll use it.
I don't
We all
have a
know
great
what it means.
alternative to it, to be honest.
Yes. In the place where you're trying to make the intervention. And that it was really important to empower local communities and to work with those and then I think it became clearer that the lessons that one can draw across countries and across systems it don't come out so easily if you're just got people focusing on individual countries or an individual sector in a country. They may know an awful lot about that context, but they may not know what worked better in in another context. So I wonder how how that gets incorporated in the idea of a new aid industry or new way of doing things. I guess part of what I want to push back on is the idea that there's a revolution rather than an evolution, or rather than there are cycles that things move a lot in one direction and then one understands the problems that there are in that direction, and then you move in a different direction. For a while the World Bank was all about structural adjustment to fix governments and institutions, and that became criticized a lot, so they went back to more project-oriented stuff. For a while, people were, as I said, all about being in the field and then the problems that come from that. So or maybe it doesn't matter if things are really revolutionizing now, or if you're just trying to give a little bit of a push to some new ways of thinking about things. But you do use quite a lot of comments about the old aid industry versus the new aid industry. And
no, you're right to put your finger on that, and it is a tough argument to make, but I see a couple of reasons why I think it is a revolution. One is just where the money comes from. So I talked about it a bit earlier, how government funding has its own kind of constructs, especially risk aversion. Well, this was an industry that was almost entirely government funded. And we think of the big international NGOs, and we know those brands, but most of their funding, at least historically, was from government, actually, right? We think of all the various institutions that are out there, the World Bank among them, the IDB among them, but if you look at where's the money coming from, it's like 5 countries that are funding almost the entire development sector. We are now quickly getting to the point where actually there'll be more private money than public money in development. That's a big thing. And I'm not including their domestic resource mobilization. I'm just talking about the international level. So, somebody like Mike Bloomberg, I talk about in the book, he's worth $61 billion. He's pledged to give away half his wealth. And he would have to get to about $2 billion a year, like now, to be on track for that. He's doing $800 million. And he's going to be bigger than, he personally will give multiples of what the Canadian government gives for global health, just him, right? So the scale of that shift, I think, is a revolutionary one, because somebody like Mike Bloomberg has a very different way of giving and a different approach and a different results orientation and can do things very differently than government. So that's one. And the second thing is something I talk about in the book that I call retail aid. So historically, we would think about large populations and how we're going to affect them, and we think about projects in part because it felt almost impossible to reach out and directly influence somebody overseas, directly help someone. So you had this long kind of chain
except from the Save the Children,
I mean, even there you have subcontractors and you have local organizations and there's a lot of infrastructure between the person writing the letter in Houston and the recipient in Nairobi. Now, I think you have the ability, because of mobile money, because of internet ubiquity, because of digital ID, we're very quickly coming to the point where everybody on Earth will be identified, will be connected, and will have some kind of financial access even before they ever see a bank. That's happening, and it's happening very quickly. So I think as that takes over, it changes the way the development industry works pretty fundamentally. Nowadays, we can actually directly go out from anywhere in the world and ask a person what they need, directly fund them, directly see what they use the money for, track whether the results of your program are working in real time. That, I think, is quite revolutionary. And I think it's going to be pretty disruptive. I think a lot of what we've come to assume are big success stories in development are going to quickly go away when we see the real data. When we look at biometric identification, see how many people really got vaccinated in that program, the number might be a lot lower than what has been reported publicly. Right? Because now we can really know. We're not using clipboards. The incentives aren't, it's not easy to cheat on that kind of data. And now we can directly ask that aid recipient, is this project working? We had a recent reporting project at Devex where we looked at several projects in Kenya, and we sent a reporter out to look at the project, see what happened. But the one was like a World Bank project to build a school, and we looked at what was actually built, and then we talked to the people in the community, asked them what happened here. And you can do that now, and you do it relatively inexpensively, and you can even do it at scale. So I think that is pretty revolutionary to the way we operate as an industry.
But what if the message that you get back when you say to people what you want is, I want to be able to travel to the market. I want a better road, or I want something that isn't going to be delivered to that individual, that isn't a bed net or a pair of shoes or something like that, but that is something that does need to be delivered at scale and funded at scale and with the cooperation of a government. I mean, another answer that might be suggest evolution rather than revolution, at least to me, would be, well, I want a government that is honest, or I want a government that doesn't, that allows investment in here, maybe in natural resources, but doesn't have corruption. They don't. All of those sorts of problems are not ones that a Mike Bloomberg's money can really address, unless he gets into the business of dealing with governments directly, which I think would be surprising.
It's problematic, but he is. I mean, if you think about what his foundation is doing, just to quickly talk about that, and I'll get back to your broader question. I mean, he is looking at things that he looked at as mayor. So he's looking at tobacco and saying tobacco is this massive problem that isn't always at the top of the agenda of a government aid agency, but for him, it's a top issue.
Right.
And so he will go in and work with governments, work with mayors and heads of state and get them to institute taxes on tobacco and advertising policies around tobacco that can influence government and public policy. And in fact, many of the billionaires are thinking in those terms. And it creates lots of questions about legitimacy and accountability, no question about that. But it does also create these opportunities. So I think you're pointing to something that I just briefly mentioned in the book. I talk about Lant Pritchett, who I know is associated with this institution, and I appreciate listening to him all the time. And he talks about the difference between human development and national development. You can make somebody's life much better at an individual level. You can educate them, feed them, but ultimately they need the road, right? Even if there's a great hospital, they need to get there somehow. So I don't see any silver bullet to this. I also think the technology that's creating all this great opportunity is in some ways maybe undermining democracy in a lot of the world. It could be undermining freedom and civil rights, civil liberties in much of the world. So there's no kind of straight path.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that this revolution that's around us and all this new technology and money doesn't create chances to do things, to do really impactful things. And it just doesn't solve it all. There isn't that button you can press where we're going to suddenly see good government and responsible government. I do think we need the international system. I see this as a kind of a plus to what we have today. So it's not like the World Bank or Mike Bloomberg. I think it's the entire ecosystem. The way we used to think of the aid industry was bilateral aid agencies. When we started Devex, we talked to our audience. We thought of as USAID and DFID employees, the ecosystem around them, some nonprofits, some contracting, implementing organizations. That was it.
And you didn't think of the multinationals.
Well, we did.
You didn't think of the World Bank because they're.
Yes, we did think of the World Bank.
IDA gives out, I think, more money to a poor country, to the very poor, than any other organization.
They do, although they still have this grant loan thing, right? So yes, they give away more in aggregate sense, and it's concessional.
Yeah.
But the bilateral folks will argue in terms of theirs is all grant funding, of course. So, but no, you're right. Those we certainly did think of people who work at the World Bank or the IDB as part of our audience, but increasingly we think of people who work at Starbucks in our audience. Starbucks. You walk into a Starbucks, it's totally normal to see the coffee of the day is from Rwanda or Guatemala, countries where more than half the population lives in extreme poverty. You don't even think twice about that. Starbucks has to source that coffee, make sure that the farmers are sending their kids to school and they're not working in the fields, make sure the quality is high, the yield is high, that the water is sustainable, right? They're a development organization in a way. And so are pension funds and investing organizations are in this sector now. And so it's a really expanded concept. And I do think there's absolutely a place for the World Bank. As an example, multiple times, every time there's a new World Bank president, there's an article that says, is the World Bank still relevant? Do we still need it? And in my mind, absolutely. And you see this growth, especially in development finance institutions. Mm-hmm. All of that infrastructure is needed. Everybody has a specialized role to play. What's different is that a much larger aid industry, which includes the private sector, investors, corporates, consumers, employees, voters, just a much broader concept, I think actually amplifies the potential of organizations like the World Bank.
And how, in your book, you talk about, and you mention here Starbucks, and you also talk about Nike, and obviously everybody's familiar with the changes that were made in factories, although, you can have an argument about just how much private companies are keeping up with the standards that
Sure.
that they've agreed. And actually, when I was in the White House, I remember that the US companies did not want to sign up to the European standards, which were going to be tougher after the Bangladeshi
Rana
fire.
Plaza,
But at some points, you talk about it as it's easy, and then you have this example that I guess is from the US about McDonald's having now becoming the biggest Apple sales organization after offering apples as an alternative to French fries to go with a Big Mac. So in some ways it seems very easy to make those changes, but then you also say actually it's quite hard when you talk about Google and Google.org and not managing it. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking, well, there's a commercial engagement, or there's a production engagement between a Starbucks, where they've got to source their coffee somewhere, consumers can have an impact on that, can talk about that, same with Nike, whereas Google.org was just a sort of free-floating thing, a little bit more like many of the billionaire or other foundations that have a very broad goal, but don't have the kind of economic engagement and their fundamental production engagement. So I wondered if that sounds right to you, or if
it does. I think you're onto something there, which is if you think of the companies we tend to think of as being very responsible, a lot of them are big brand names we've heard of.
Yeah.
And there's a reason, because they're worried about their consumers, and the consumers' attitudes are changing fast. And even investors are, average investors, because they're familiar with those brands, they can vote with their dollars and say, I'm not going to invest in that company, or I am. But obviously a lot of economic activity are businesses that are not big brand names. And I think in the case of Google, you're right. What they did was kind of a standalone. It wasn't aligned to their business. Whereas the McDonald's example is very aligned. They sell food by saying we'll offer apples. That's something they can do, and they can have a really big impact. And that doesn't change the fact that McDonald's as an overall entity is providing a lot of unhealthy food too, and causing lots of problems as well, you could argue. So it's not like it means everything is okay.
Right.
But I think, in a way, all the activism of the 70s and the 80s, the Greenpeace people who got in front of the boat, in a way, we're reaping the benefits of that activism today. Because there actually are corporate leaders and corporate boards and major investors who say, business has to be different. And so I would argue, and I do in this book, let's take advantage of that opportunity. We don't have to be Pollyannas about it and think everything's going to be perfect, but let's take advantage of that and push the companies that are going in the right direction to do more, and call out the ones that aren't. Fundamentally, this is one of the themes I talk about, is we just lack a lot of accountability in our industry. There's still a sense, and this is sort of the old aid model, that just by doing something good, by announcing you're doing something good, by trying to do something good, you're good. And that is obviously not going to be sufficient in a world where we have this much more complex industry with lots of new players in it. There needs to be some standard of accountability. That's not easy to get to. Everyone measures results in different ways. But in a way, the corporates are easier than other players, because if they're public, they have to be pretty transparent. Increasingly, they're publishing sustainability reports against recognized standards. Increasingly, they have investors who care about this. At Google, how many thousands of employees walked out over gender discrimination, right? I mean, that really got the attention of the Google management, because that's their number one asset. So there are levers you can use, and that I think people are using, to make corporates better citizens. It's happening.
Yeah, but I think it has to be linked very much to the bottom line. Larry Summers, who's obviously on the CGG board, wrote a very good piece about the U.S. corporate move saying we need to worry about stakeholders and not just shareholders, and with very specific suggestions about how regulations might be needed to make sure that was followed.
Yeah.
But and one thing about accountability, you mention in the book, but you don't really talk that much about it. You mentioned it here about investors and the whole ESG movement, which I think has really ballooned, and more or less every investment firm, major money manager is offering, at least in the United States, an ESG product of some kind. But measuring those is extremely difficult.
It is.
And the E part, well, at least there's some more and more recognition and agreement around environmentally sustainability. The G part with governance, you can do certain things about diversity on the board and having proper audit committees and other things like that. The S part, the social part, is really hard to measure and very easy to bluff your way through.
It is.
So does there need to be some crowdsourcing, data providing entity, or is this something that places like CGD and then on the other end of the spectrum, places like the World Bank need to be figuring out how to measure what's good and what's not good, or do you leave it to the donors themselves? How do we address that?
I
how
think
do you
that-
share lessons as
That
well?
space, I think, is moving very fast, and it is market driven. Because you have all these investors now, there are lots of examples where what you might think of as ESG, someone else disagrees. There have been ESG index funds that include tobacco companies
Yes,
or oil
exactly.
company. It all depends on sort of what you value and measure. So, but there's huge activity in that space. There's the Global Reporting Initiative. Lots of companies are thinking about this and working on it. You're right, the S is the fuzziest, and a lot of people use job creation as kind of a general area. It's so common to see companies stand up at Davos or formerly at the Clinton Global Initiative and announce these really big things. By this year, we're going to do this. And it's so hard to know, did they do that? And how do you measure that? What's the baseline? Is it incremental?
Right.
So you're right to have all that skepticism, but I actually think the ESG space is moving a lot more. The bigger challenge is going to be in the philanthropic space. In some ways, corporates are adopting the Sustainable Development Goal framework faster than anybody else. And they understand if the rules are changing and investors are pushing us, we need to know what are those standards, and we will try to follow them. But what are the levers to use for that billionaire philanthropist or even that ordinary donor? I talk about in the book orphanages and all the damages that orphanages have caused, and that's largely funded by individual donors who are often people who are trying to do something good in the world, and they mean well. Is there any accountability there, and how do we hold them to an ESG sort of standard? So I actually think, in a way, the investing world is further ahead. They're moving, and much more to be done, and the groups like CGD do have a role to play there, but I would much rather see a lot of focus and attention on the philanthropy side, which often gets a pass. A lot of the new philanthropies are set up as LLCs, so there's no transparency at all about what they're doing with the money. So forget about measuring it. You don't even know what they're spending it on. And then they can basically pick any standard they want. In the US, our laws around this are very open. You set up your organization as a 501c3 or as an LLC, but just spend on charitable goods, charitable things, you get the tax deduction. And there's really no standards about how you spend it or what you spend it on. And so we may need some new regulation and legislation around that.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, especially because it's so political. And so I want to turn to people's questions. I hope people have been thinking about questions that you have. But I want to ask you about a quite fundamental thing, which is all of the examples in your book, and you have many about failed approaches. There's one about the well that got put in by unenlightened old aid industry people, and it didn't work because the rope for the water broke. And it wasn't obvious to me in that case why having it funded in a different way would make people mend the rope. But anyway, you talk a lot about some very specific examples and good stories. But if we step back and think, there's been this fantastic success. The people in the aid industry should really sort of pat themselves on the back, that there has been a massive reduction of the number of people living in poverty. And if we ask, well, why was that? What were the really big drivers of those really big moves? They were of a macro nature, I would argue. I mean, obvious large one, because it's got a lot of people, is China, and that was opening up to the outside world, allowing the market to work more, but also allowing the private sector in that case. Or at the other end of the spectrum, Ethiopia, we talked about this a bit earlier, where the government was very important in promoting agricultural change and also much better health services. And it wasn't the provision of specific drugs or specific bed nets. It was having a health system that could that required institutions and governments to run it. So those really big shifts come from different kinds of money, from the retail-based specific donor relationship with the bottom up. So how do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very big question. Like, what has caused human development in the last 50 years is a big one. When I was born in 1975, 4 in 10 people on Earth were living in extreme poverty. It's now 1 in 10. I mean, that's a huge success. But you're right. At the macro level, it's things like China. It's things like technology. And that's technology across the board. Mobile telephony, vaccines that don't need to be stored in a cold chain. Lots of technological advances, improved seeds, all these things. But at the base of it, if you look, there are lots of examples, I think, where individuals, sometimes even small groups, got together and pushed something and created significant change. So Gavi is an example, right, where you have a public-private partnership that's, I think, saved something like 7 million kids' lives now with vaccination. We talk PEPFAR is another one I talk about in the book, and that's, one U.S. president, a small group got together and said, we're going to get this thing through Congress and spend a lot of money and find a way to save millions of lives in sub-Saharan Africa principally. And there are examples, I think, where old aid had huge successes. And obviously it's an oversimplification to say there's old aid and then there's new aid and there's some moment in time when that happens. But I use that as a device, hopefully, to help us think through what were things like before, even with successes, and what would we want to be different in the future. And because there's no silver bullet, because there's no one macro thing, we know what's going to come in a way. We know the technological advances are going to continue. That trend line is pretty clear. We know there's going to be a lot more money in the space, and that there's going to be, that everything is globalizing and localizing sort of at the same time. So based on all that, what should we do differently now? That's kind of the construct that I'm using. And so it isn't to say aid has worked or aid has not worked. That is a rich debate, and I love listening to that debate, but it's often kind of an impossible debate, because we look at these big economic studies and we say, can you prove that people have been brought out of poverty by this? And you hear economists have this conversation. It's really fascinating, but it somehow takes away all the political context and the history, and everyone who knows development work and does it knows as soon as you get to the actual example, the individual country like in Ethiopia, that's when it gets interesting and hard. But I think what we're looking at now is we have opportunities in really every place, even the hardest places, to bring new tools, new models to bear that can actually accelerate the rate of poverty reduction, that can help us get to that end line. I do interview Bill Gates in the book and ask him about this question, and he says, I think rightly, we're not going to hit the poverty goal by 2030, which itself is kind of a wavering goal, because you can have up to 3% of people still living in poverty and still technically reach the goal. But we're unlikely to at this point. But the broad trajectory is clear, that we're heading in that direction.
Yeah. With general growth and globalization, assuming that kind of continues. It would be interesting to hear from any of you, your own experiences, your own concerns, your questions, obviously, to Raj. So who would like to kick off here? And there are mics, so... and if you could just say who you are briefly.
Sure. I'm Scott Kleinberg, Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, formerly with USAID after 24 years. So what donors have come to acknowledge now is that in countries where the cases are the most difficult, where poverty is still prevalent and we have not gotten traction, that we need to take systems approaches, We need to take market-driven approaches. But when you look at the donor portfolios, they are still stovepiped. They're procured sequentially, so they're not aligned. And they may even be having different geographic or subjective focuses. Then when you look across donors in a country, donor coordination still means let's not duplicate what we're working on. And it doesn't seem like that's going to get us where we want to get to. And so the question I have is, what are the forces that are emerging that could drive donors to walk the talk and actually get even to the point of, well, donors collaborating in terms of what their design should be and how and their choice of implementation tools, and really being strategic and systematic in how they're implementing?
Great question, Scott. Thank you. Yeah, you think about some of the countries that are having the best successes. Rwanda comes to mind, Ethiopia comes to mind, and there, the governments are the ones doing the donor coordination, right? And there's lots of criticisms of those governments, but those governments are also in the aid picture saying, we will convene you, we will tell you what we want to do. We have a clear strategy, and that can work. Unfortunately, there are more cases where that is not happening and where donors themselves are coming with their own strategies. And of course, the politics takes over, and every time there's a new change of administrator or head of these agencies, there's a new policy for writing roadmaps and country strategies. And there's so much kind of strategic thinking all the time that you have to add on to the political calendar within those countries. I think a couple of things are moving and have a chance to maybe move this dynamic. One is the billionaire philanthropy. This is kind of there's a good side, maybe a bad side of the coin. The good side is you see institutions like the Gates Foundation saying, where can we partner with government where they're doing things well and support some of the things that traditional aid might not have, like the data that they need to make decisions, or the data collection tools, or the best practices in training. I was in Rwanda recently, went to the University of Global Health Equity, and that's a donor-driven university in rural Rwanda, and they're training health ministers and health ministry officials on sort of best practices around health system strengthening. So that's a private donor-funded kind of initiative that might very well get us to the country-led strategic approach that we need to see. So I think there are real opportunities in this new era that we're in. And the other one I would just point to is the rise of the technological tools and the ability to know what's happening more quickly, to have those real-time results. Hopefully, there's a little more light that's shown on our industry. We still haven't gotten to the point where it's easy, even for a researcher at CGD who knows the industry really well, to just know what's happening. It's very hard to actually see that picture. When we started Devex, one of our kind of models was Bloomberg. We said, okay, if you work on Wall Street, you get this Bloomberg terminal, and you can see what's happening to stock prices and bond prices and the news. You get it all, right? We want that in development. We still don't really have that. We've been working toward that for years now, but the reality is you get a lot of old information. You hear what was announced, not necessarily what actually was spent. It's hard to know what's really going on. So I think that's the other piece that I'm looking forward to, is just a more open, transparent view of the actual market and development. I think that might push us in the right direction too.
And you do talk about that quite a bit in the book about open source and information. Of course, development is a much more complicated thing than financial markets. And the measurement.
Had I known that in 2000, we might not have started Devex, by the way.
Yes, right. So just as well you didn't know, and Joe and I didn't tell you. Over here.
Thank you very much. It's been a very interesting talk.
Can you just tell us who you are?
I'm Jed Moline with USAID currently. And my question is, hearing about all these new players, from Starbucks to the philanthropies to others entering the development field, many of them new, many of innovative, not in the world before, and you, Devex, being the supplier of the people, the pipeline, one of them, but a major one, of bringing people into the development world, analogous to the donors and the philanthropists trying to find a way to measure their quality and the impact, are there tools for measuring the quality and the talent and the skills of the people entering the workforce, or is anybody with a passport qualified to do development? I mean, are there tools? Obviously, SAVE and CGD, we know how to look at a resume and say this person is qualified for this job. but that innovative player may not, in which case resources that could otherwise be well spent might be diverted or go in the wrong direction. Are there tools being developed or seen in this new brave new world to help gauge, certify the talent pool that's entering it from all sorts of new spigots into all sorts of new buckets?
The answer is yes, and I actually think it's a great question because it points to kind of one of the big challenges we've had as an industry, which is that it's been a very U.S. or European-dominated sector, right? You look across the biggest institutions doing work in developing countries, and of course we know what the picture is like in terms of the staffing. And when we started Devex, I remember going to meet with somebody who was a top position at a big NGO, and I said, why don't you hire more people in developing countries? And she said, well, it's really hard to find them, and we're not sure that the talent exists. And so the way traditionally we've done this is to say, well, if you want a job, and you still see this on our website, if you look at the job board, 20 years experience, you need to speak these 3 languages fluently, you need to have a PhD. It's kind of, it's designed to be impossible, right? It's designed for 3 people in the world can take that job. And it shows where our priorities are, because if our priority really were, actually the first thing is you have to hire someone from that community. That's got to happen. That's the first priority. Maybe that's more important than the rest of the skills, because that's the way you develop a sustainable approach to whatever this initiative might be. Or if you look at it from the private sector approach, which is to say, let's go out there and acquire talent and develop that talent, as opposed to expecting someone to have all of the right skills and credentials on day one. That I think that is a pretty big shift for the way our industry works. So are there assessment tools being developed? And there are many assessment tools. There are many more advanced ones, including ones that use artificial intelligence and all kinds of ways of assessing somebody's capabilities and fit for a culture or a job. But
Careful with that one.
Right. But I think the bigger opportunity is as an industry to say, let's move away from a recruitment mindset, which is kind of we post a job and we get 1,000 resumes and then we filter them to see who matches these impossible requirements, and to a much more of a talent acquisition and development mindset, which is the way the private sector thinks. And I think that also opens the opportunity for much more diversity, gender diversity, for diversity by ethnic origin, for hiring people in the countries. You know, a lot of the countries we're talking about now graduate tens of thousands of people with graduate degrees. There are many professionals from a lot of the major middle income, especially developing countries, but it's still hard for them to get into work in our industry. So this is a really rich area that we need to work on, and assessment is a piece of it, it's an important piece of it, but I think it's also a mindset shift.
Other questions that people have? Yes, the lady in the back there.
Yes, my name is Katie Garcia. I'm also with USAID, and I work a lot with private sector engagement. And so it's actually a sort of a similar talent and talent attraction. So while we may be moving towards this new aid, old aid is going to exist. You know, USAID isn't going anywhere as far as I know. But we do have a hard time attracting folks who have private sector skill sets into the agency. And those we have often moved on to do other things. And so in order to be really good partners to these new development actors, I guess it's sort of a similar question, but I mean, I guess the thing is, it's like we do have to attract talent that can hit the ground running. We also have to create opportunities for growth. I just was wondering if you had any thoughts about, not all of us can go work for these cool new billionaire folks, right? Some of us are going to continue working in what is the more traditional bilateral and multilateral aid agencies and implementers of these aid agencies. So how do we bring in the talent to these more sort of traditional routes? Thanks.
It's a great question, and I have not checked Twitter since we sat here. So as far as I know, USAID still exists. Yeah, and you're right. And first of all, let me say about the billionaire organizations, like, yes, some of them are exciting, some of them are going to be problematic too. And we need in the new era that I think we're entering, we need the bilateral institutions. In fact, there's more of them. More countries are setting up bilateral aid agencies. I think that's a good thing. And you're right, the skill set is a bit different. It's almost like the skill set is around financial engineering and kind of an investment mindset. Those are the things that are required, right? Like, you need people who can say, well, the problem is contraceptive access, okay? And that's been a problem for a long time. There's 215 million women in the world who don't have access to contraception. Well, yeah, that's a health problem, but it's also a markets problem. It's a technology problem. It's a financing problem. And so you need kind of a holistic development professional who can think across those and can say, I know what the latest tech is in mobile money, because maybe that's useful in this case. Maybe it can provide subsidies directly to people who need to buy them. I know what the latest thinking is around real-time data and supply chains. I know how to partner with private sector companies that might develop and deliver these contraceptives. So you need this kind of mindset, right? And how you attract people like that into a place like USAID? Well, in my sense, there's dramatic demand for people to have a career that has real
meaningful.
impact, that gets to work on these kind of problems. So I don't want to say it's easy to reform our systems, especially in government, to attract people like that, but they're out there and they're hungry for this work. It used to be when I would go to universities and give a talk about getting a job in development, it would be the people who study development who are in the room. Now it's MBAs, it's engineering students. I mean, you name it. Every department in a university, they want to do development work. So it may require new models. Maybe it requires an outsourced model of some kind where you're funding an institution that can bring in and develop talent that might not otherwise be ready to join a government job. That's possible. But the talent, I think, is out there. I think the opportunity does exist to find people like this.
Yeah, I mean, Masood and others here can talk about, know well about DFID, but my impression is that that for a while that was the most attractive government agency for incoming people who got into the highly regarded British civil service. That was at a time when the government had a lot of interest in the mission.
Sure.
And met individuals. I'm not sure that with some of the changes that's still the case, but I fully agree with you that there's a lot of mission driven interest. I wanted to ask about another issue which is very relevant for CGD, I think, and also for another nonprofit that I was on the board of for a while that focuses on data and measurement and analysis and research. And that can be a real struggle for funding, because a lot of people, despite this new world, actually want to see the kinds of results. They don't want to figure out how to measure the results or how to dig into that question, but they just want to be told that this is, they want to have some sort of more human connection with the results. So how do you see the making research, data gathering, measurement, and all of those things sexy for funders?
I mean, I think it's getting to be sexier and sexier because a lot of the funding is coming out of hedge funds and Wall Street or Silicon Valley, people who are very used to data. I talk about GiveWell in the book, and those are two former hedge fund analysts who thought, well, we're making too much money in our 20s. Let's donate some. Like, how do we find out who to donate it to? Who's doing the best work? And they were surprised there was so little data. And so they started this institution, and now they measure and track in a very rigorous way and a very transparent way what they think are the best buys, basically, in global development. I think they have 8 organizations and initiatives they currently recommend. So I think in a way it's a lot easier than it was. I also have a chart in the book about randomized controlled trials and how much they've gone up. They're petered off now, but there is more funding and more interest in data, I think, today than there ever was. Gates Foundation has put in, I think, almost $400 million now into IHME, which studies health metrics, because they were shocked at how little data there was on this, and that's a public good that anybody can access. So it is a challenge, and you still have lots of donors who think it's all about my personal connection to the issue. I don't think that's going to go away. I mean, we're all human beings. We do have that emotional side. We're not all robotic, but I think it's a combination increasingly. People who are, with their heart, they care about an issue or a part of the world, and they want to help. But then with their head, they're saying, okay, but let me see what's the return on investment again if I do this. And in order to do the return on investment calculation, you need some baseline data. So it's not easy, and I also have sat on boards of nonprofits and currently do, and I know how tough this is. Yeah. But I think it's easier than it ever was.
Well, that's optimistic. Yes.
Hi. Thank you. Hi, I'm Jocelyn Lair. I'm an affiliated researcher at UCSF, Center for Global Reproductive Health. So one thing, I've been here in DC for 5.5 years now, and one thing that's been interesting for me to observe just on the topic of data, my question is about quality. It's been interesting to see content in the gray literature, evaluation studies, other kinds of reports put forth by reputable organizations that don't necessarily adhere to the highest standards of what would be considered academic level research. And it has been perturbing to me to see that, to see really well-respected groups putting out work that would not pass a peer review. And so I am curious, as the field becomes all the more diversified and all the more interdisciplinary, I think it's a question that applies to the development field in general. How can we hold ourselves to high standards, and is there a way to imagine a peer review for the development world?
It's a great question. I talk in the book about the worm wars. Are you familiar with that issue? This is the war around deworming pills, right? There was a well-known randomized controlled trial that showed that deworming pills might just be the silver bullet. I mean, they might just have the best return on investment you can get. And then there was peer review around it, and there was some controversy about the data, and it caused this huge blow up where you saw these normally very reserved economists who were now on Twitter, calling each other names and really getting angry. And I don't come down on one side or the other in the book. I just say my view, which is that this is a good sign that we're having these kinds of debates about data and about what's the right data and what's the standard of evidence that we require before we make an investment in something. This is the right conversation to be having. So I don't have a real answer to how do you get to the point you want to see, but we're having that debate now. We're talking about the standards of evidence in our industry. That was not always the case. And we're having, investors, people are calling themselves investors, not just donors, and they're thinking in those terms. So I think we're headed at least somewhat in that right direction. The danger can come, especially since you've been in this town 5 years, when we politicize these issues. And then I think the political imperative becomes more important than the results imperative. And I see that a little bit with what's happening with China, where China is becoming kind of the answer to every question about why we do this work on both sides of the aisle. And in a way, it's exciting because we can get more money from Congress and we get more support from the White House, and it's great. The downside is this issue, which is that you then start to say, well, we're doing this for this other reason, and you might pay less and less attention to the actual results of the things we're funding. And I think that's what we saw during the Cold War, which was lots of money went to aid, lots of it got wasted because we were fighting a different battle. It wasn't really about development.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. On randomized controlled trials, obviously they have some really great aspects that they help to show what works and what doesn't work, although they can also be, the results can be debated, as you point out. But do they tend to, there's a whole thing about the old economist joke about looking under the lamppost because that's where the light is, rather than where you might have dropped your keys. Do they take attention away from some of the bigger issues, some of the harder issues to deal with about institutions, about systems, about government, and about how to raise economic growth, rather than how to distribute the worm pills?
No, I think the issue that I've heard about, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, is that they tend to be so context specific. So there's nothing wrong with knowing what works and what doesn't. I mean, that's a good thing to know, right? And anybody would want to know that before you go investing in a project. Is it going to work? But they're so context specific. They take time. They're expensive. So increasingly, I think what the learning is from doing lots of these randomized controlled trials is actually maybe we can, instead of randomizing, instead of doing these at the level that might be peer reviewable or at the highest level, highest standard, maybe we can take elements of a randomized controlled trial and do it in an iterative way and move to kind of a dashboard approach to operating a development initiative where you're getting data all along, you're measuring key performance indicators, you're seeing how things are going, and if things aren't working, you're pivoting and you're iterating. You're not trying to solve it with that RCT up front and then say, this is the answer, it's the deworming pills. So that's what I see a lot of movement toward. And in fact, this chart I have in the book of RCT shows they go way up around 2005. They start exploding over 100, 150 a year. And then just until like 2016, they start dipping. And it's because I think donors have started to realize they're just not as adaptable to the real world as they might like. So they are an important tool. We probably don't want to get rid of RCTs. It's just they're, again, not the silver bullet. They're a tool.
Not a silver bullet. In the back.
Oh, how can you say that? I think, less than 1%.
Sorry, can you
I'm
introduce
Amanda
yourself?
Glassman from the Center
I
for
know
Global
you,
Development.
Amanda, but
Less than 1% of development aid is rigorously evaluated in any way. Forget randomized control trials. So I think methods are about the question that you're asking about effectiveness. So just some thought on that. But maybe a question for you about what is the, I haven't read the book yet, but I will definitely buy it now. But your sense that the field is moving towards results. Can you give 2 or 3 examples of where that is happening? Because I work in global health. We talk a lot about results in the aggregate, but it's actually quite hard to find the kinds of interventions that are generating results that you can attach directly to the spending and activities that are being financed. So I'd love to hear where are those key examples and what else could we be doing to push this agenda forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is easy for me to be overly optimistic about it, but I do think the trend line is clear. Even if it's a small amount today that's tied to results, where the money is going, where the mindset shift is going, I think is toward results. And the easiest ones are the global health examples that are easy to measure, like vaccines. So a group like Gavi, which tends to be very results oriented, and if you look at a lot of the zero goal efforts, like the polio eradication campaign, those are the kinds of things that are very much, the argument is around, well, yes, it's $50 million per polio case today, but we can do the math on if we get those done and we know which things work, this is how much we're going to save over time. So I think there are examples like that. I think you see a lot more funding going into a tiered model, where this is from the philanthropic world, but even from USAIDs of the world. So I talk about in the book Hello Tractor, which is a great example of an initiative that came out of USAID's Development Innovation Ventures. And they are now the Uber of tractors. So they start out with this basic idea that, if you're in the US, tractors were invented 110 years ago or something, 120 years ago. But if you're in lots of other economies in the world, it's very hard to get one, they're too expensive. Developed an Uber-like technology. Now 75% of the tractors coming into Nigeria use Hello Tractor technology. They're in 5 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. They're absolutely exploding the way we think of Uber exploding, right? So these are cases where in the past, they probably never would have gotten funding at all. And now they're getting a small amount of funding, and they're seeing if it works, and they're getting more. They're seeing if it works, and they're getting more. So it is a results orientation. We're a long way from there, but I think this is the mindset shift that I see happening.
Okay. Maybe that is a good note, an upbeat note on which to end. And I'd like to thank Raj very much for coming and for writing the book, for coming here, and for sharing your insights. And we'll look on the positive side.
Thank you. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Nancy, Masood. I appreciate it. Thank you.